Welcome to the Yale Center for British Art. I'm Courtney J. Martin. I'm the Mellon Director of the museum. And I am so delighted to welcome this year's winner of the Windham-Campbell Prize in Fiction, Tsitsi Dangarembga.
Thank you, Courtney.
Before we get started, I have a little bit of housekeeping to do. Yale University and the Yale Center for British Art acknowledge that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chigadocoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and the other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded the land and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people, these nations, and this land. After the discussion, we'll take questions from the audience. Please wait for the microphone to come to you before speaking. For those of you who are viewing us remotely, please email your questions to ycba.programs, programs, at yale.edu. Tsitsi Dangarembga is the author of 3 groundbreaking novels: Nervous Conditions, 1988, The Book of Naught, 2006, and This Mournable Body from 2018. This trilogy tells the story of a young Shona woman's coming of age from 1960s pre-independence Rhodesia to the post-colonial Zimbabwe of the 1990s. Her life and that of her country intersect in compelling and sometimes tragic ways. Together, these novels have established Dangarembga as one of the most significant voices in Anglophone literature. She is also a filmmaker and serves as director of the Institute of Creative Arts for Progress in Africa Trust, executive director of the Women Filmmakers of Zimbabwe, and founding director of the International Images Film Festival for Women. In 2021, she was awarded the PEN International Award for Freedom of Expression. She lives in Harare, Zimbabwe, though she is currently a fellow at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute in Cambridge. Tsitsi.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that we could get started by setting a bit of the groundwork for the trilogy. You have been awarded the Windham-Campbell for This Mournable Body, but it is the entire trilogy that I think that sets a real tone for where you end up with this novel. Many of your readers, including me, were introduced to 20th century Rhodesia, then Zimbabwe, by way of your writing. Can you tell us a bit about the stakes of writing about the nation state?
Yes, thank you for that question, and hello everybody, good afternoon, thank you for being here. I have found that I did not set out to write about the nation state. I set out to write about the experiences of a person in the nation state. And I found that I could not actually separate the two, especially when writing about a nation state that was in transition, that was in turmoil. In part of the trilogy, it was at war. And all of these things that happen in the nation state impact on people living in that country. And so really, I found that my character, the protagonist, Tambudzai Sigalke, who starts off as a young girl who wants to go to school, is a kind of a reflection for what has happened in the country. That wasn't my intention. It is something that people pointed out to me and something that I realized I had done. But I think that it is inevitable if one writes from the place that I write from, which is I am concerned about the actual well-being and dignity of people in the particular society that I'm talking about.
Can you tell us about our protagonist, Tambu? Who is she?
Yes, Tambudzai is a character that I created for several reasons. She is a young girl when we meet her. She lives in a reserve, a tribal trust land, very similar to the reserves that would have been and perhaps still exist in this country, or maybe under a different name. The name has changed in Zimbabwe now since independence. They were called reserves in the colonial times, and now they're called communal lands. But the actual structure and economic situation of these lands, which is one of deprivation, has not changed. So this is where Tambudzai lives when we meet her. And the situation in Zimbabwe is that when the colonialists arrived at the end of the 19th century, they needed labor. And so they designated these reserves as African areas, but they needed to entice the men out to the cities in order to provide the labor that they needed. So this led to a situation where people always had a place that they called home, which was not the place where they conducted the business that sustained their livelihoods. And this has gone on until today. So many families will have what they call their traditional home. They could be doctors, they could be professors here in New Haven or whatever, but they will still have this traditional home in this area, this reserve, or tribal trust land, as they were also called. And it's called Kumusha, which means home. So this is where Tambudzai lives, and there is absolutely nothing. I mean, in colonial times, there would have been the colonial administration building, and next to that, there would have been a clinic that provided basics like aspirin and so forth, probably some kind of maternity care as well. And next to that, there would have been a beer hall. So those were the three structures that the colonial administration deemed important and necessary. Then there would be schools dotted around, and these would have been primary schools for entry level for about 7 years of schooling, and that was considered sufficient for the African population. And these schools were few and far between, and you had to pay money for them. And so Tambudzai lives in this condition. She is the second child. She has an elder brother who goes to one of these schools, which is about maybe 5 miles away. And her parents cannot pay the fees for her to go to school. So they have taken her out of school. She's been to school for a year or two, and her parents can no longer pay the fees. And so she's been taken out of school. So when we meet her, she is a very dissatisfied and disgruntled young girl. She wants a life that will enable her to live a more dignified existence than these reserves offer her. The belief is that education is the only way forward, and this has already been taken away from her at the age of about 8 or 9. So this is the person that we meet in nervous conditions.
Her subjecthood is so fragile, in a sense, because of what you've exactly described, and immediately you're taken into her cause. I want so much more for her as the reader. I am hoping, for this next step. And I wondered if there's a way in which the complications of her life, how are they resolved over this period of time? Because in real time, the trilogy lasts for 30 years. So 1988, the first book is released. By 2018, the last, or what we think is the last, maybe it's not. And I just want to know, what is it like to write the trajectory of someone else's life over that period of time, which is also a lifetime for you as a person?
Yeah, that was really interesting. It wasn't planned like that. In fact, I hadn't planned to write a trilogy at all. Excuse me. I thought Zimbabwe is independent now, and I want to write a book that will encourage young women to go for whatever they want to go for. This was in the early 1980s, and Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980. And so I thought, people don't know that there are possibilities out there. I am fortunate. I have been able to travel. I've had a lifestyle that's enabled me to experience some of these opportunities. And I want other young women, no matter where they come from in Zimbabwe, to have that understanding also. And so that's what I thought I was going to do. But then as I wrote, I began to understand the complications of what I was writing about. And I realized I wasn't going to resolve those complications in one novel. So the novel ends with Tambudzai achieving her ambition of going back to school and actually acquiring a good school education. It ends with her going to high school, or secondary school as we call it in Zimbabwe. But she has interacted with another part of the extended family, and this is her rich uncle, Babamkuru, relatively rich, who had been educated in England and taken his children to England with him and brought them back. And so with that family and those characters, I was pointing to the challenges that attend achieving your desires. You desire to move out of your community, but what happens when you move out of your community? Can you move back into your community? Can you be accepted as a member of that community? However, Babamkuru, this uncle, is the person who pays her fees, who enables her to get this education. So I realized really about how complex the situation is. And I realized that by sending Tambudzai to this school to get further education, I was setting her on the same trajectory as her cousin, who had been taken out of her community. And in fact, at the end of the book, Of Nervous Conditions, the first book, Tambudzai's mother is completely unhappy about the fact that Tambudzai is going to leave to go to this particular school. And she says, you're going to come back. I won't recognize you. You'll be speaking English. We won't be able to talk to each other, this kind of thing. And I wasn't able to resolve those issues in Nervous Conditions. And then it took so long because this school that Tambudzai goes to was what we called a multiracial school. And they had quotas. And I think it was something like 3% black people in a school of white people. And there would have been quotas for people who were considered colored, and that would have included people of Asian background. And so I was writing in the early 1980s, and in making one of his early addresses to the nation, the first Prime Minister and the second President of Zimbabwe, the late Robert Mugabe, had said, we are all one happy family now. We don't have to talk about what happened before. We have to beat our swords into plowshares and build the country.
But can I just break here, just to give the audience a sense of what he could be alluding to? So he could be alluding to, colonization by way of Rhodesia in the 1890s, but he's also alluding to the outbreak of the Civil War in '65, and then ultimately the peace agreement in April of 1980, which then inaugurates, his, I don't want to say reign, but, very long service to the country. Mm-hmm. So it's wrapped up in that sentiment that all of those things just need to be collapsed, to forget.
This is the interesting thing, because there was a long war of liberation from like about 65 until 79, when they had a conference at Lancaster House in London, and the liberation movements and the colonial government, which was Ian Smith's government at the time, made this agreement, the Lancaster House Agreement. So I think this is something that happens often in Zimbabwe with ZANU-PF, is that they say things, but you don't know exactly what they are alluding to. So it's open to interpretation. So I interpreted it as we have to do things that promote solidarity amongst the different communities and races in our country. And so to now have continued the story of Tambudzai's experience in this school, which was a predominantly white school, and not only was it predominantly white, but it was in Mutare, a small city called Amtali at the time. And that small city served a farming community. So you would have had a lot of children of white farmers who only knew black people as people to command and to make work for them in order to produce profit for them. So this is the situation that Tambudzai went into. And the reason why I wanted to put her there was that I realized that at some point we would have to examine those race relations, no matter what the president had said, but it didn't seem to be time. So then Nervous Conditions was not published for several years after I'd written it. I couldn't find a publisher, so I went to film school in Germany, and that was in 1989. In 2000, the land reform program began in Zimbabwe, and this was a program in which ZANU-PF appropriated land from white farmers to give to black people. And it was basically giving because the state still owns the land and people were given 99-year leases, something like that. I think that's the framework for it. And that really brought all those racial conflicts that we had ignored for such a long time to the fore. Mm-hmm. And that is when I thought, now is the moment for me to write the second book about Tambudzai's life that looks at racism as a child like that would have experienced it. And what was very positive for me is that I did not have to include patriarchy to a great extent because it's an all-girls school. So the dimension of difference was race.
Wow. In my very early copy of the first book, the word patriarchy in my 19-year-old handwriting is written over and over and over again, as if somehow this is emanating from the pages, and then it stops, at a certain point, because I think as we're nearing the end of the novel, that her ascent into education is going to shift that. The tenor of the first novel is launched by an epigraph taken from Fennell's Wretched of the Earth. The condition of the native is a nervous condition, right? And that is also where the title comes from. The second novel, The Book of Naught, does not have an epigraph, but it does actually have this very interesting kind of diagram of all of our major players, which had not been in the first, right? But then the third novel delivers us into a kind of hopefulness of Lorraine Hansberry's words from A Raisin in the Sun, where she's written, "There is always something left to love." That's the epigraph for the book. How do you get from Fannell's Francophone Caribbean psychoanalytics to Hansberry's Midwest American civil rights theatricality?
That's a really big question. And I'm glad I didn't think of it in those terms when I was writing it.
I've had 30 years to work this out, though. I've been thinking about it for a long time, Tsitsi.
Yes. People used to say to me after I'd written Nervous Conditions, they said to me that Nyasha is going to die in conversations with people. That's Tambudzai's cousin, one of the other protagonists in the book. And they said they see no hope for her. They see no hope for a girl like her surviving under that particular brand of patriarchy, which is combined with a traditional culture. And so it became my mission to make sure that the girls survived. In fact, I wanted everybody to survive, apart from the brother who is sacrificed early on, so that the story can take place. And at the same time, I was a young woman at the University of Zimbabwe and learning feminism. And because it was Zimbabwe, we were learning several kinds of feminisms. And I did start reading Black feminist work that was emanated from the United States. And I can distinctly remember one day while I was a student, I think it was in a book that discussed for colored girls who have considered suicide, the rainbow is enough. And that discussion was saying, as a Black woman, your duty, your first duty is to stay alive. And so I said to myself, this is the duty I am going to take on for my two characters. And the question then became, how do we stay alive? In the second book, in the Book of Not, Tambudzai thinks you stay alive by turning your back on other Black people who are in your community, by doing your best to integrate yourself with the white community around you, pacify them, if you like. So the book is a comment on being complicit in our own racial oppression. So at the end of that book, Tambudzai is in a really bad state at the end of the Book of Not. And so I found I had to redeem her, and I had to find a way to redeem her. And the way that I was able to do this was to have her reconnect with women from nervous conditions in a way where she had to acknowledge that she had some debt to them because their support of her had emanated from love. And one of these women is an aunt who had been a guerrilla in the war. And the country is in crisis in this Mournable Body. It's written around, the period is around the turn of the millennium, around the time of the land reform, but it is contemporary in the issues that it discusses. And a lot of the people who were part of the liberation struggle, who did not become the ruling elite, are very disappointed with the way things have gone. But they continue to identify with the struggle that made them leave the country to join the guerrilla movement. That is a kind of love for an ideal that you had for your country. And this aunt of Tambudzai's is able to show that love to the people around her as well. And she reconnects with her cousin Yasha, and it is the love of these women that enables her to understand that there is something beyond personal achievement that is important. And the book ends with her going back to the homestead and having to decide whether to engage in an act of love or to continue on her trajectory of material improvement and personal accumulation. And so I wanted to point out that none of the good things that could have happened and the transformation that happens with Tambudzai from this really quite unsympathetic character in the beginning to somebody that we can feel for at the end is a trajectory that is only possible when we are able to love, because love brings out the best in us. And this can happen even in a country that your former president called a shithole.
Former.
Yes.
Yeah.
I did say former.
Yeah, no,
right?
no. I just wanted to underscore. I was just jumping on. You know, does that? You know, it is almost as if we watch her in the Book of Not. She decolonizes as a person. Is she complete?
This is a very interesting question. What does being a complete person mean? I think being a complete person means something different to me and to you here, sitting here in New Haven, to what it means if you are sitting in let's say, one of these reserves in Zimbabwe. I think the idea of completeness of a person is a cultural thing. You know, like today, we have a crisis in the country. It's political, it's economic, and there are people who are engaging with that. And you will have people pushing back and saying, why do you waste your time and your energy? You should be out seeing how you can manage to acquire a little bit of wealth that you can help to distribute to your extended family. So for them, that is being a complete person. But for the people who are engaging with what we see to be the critical points in the nation, in the politics and in the economy, we see that as being a complete person. So from the point, in fact, though, I think Tambuzai was not complete from either point of view. So she was extremely incomplete when we see her at the end of the Book of Not and the beginning of this Mournable Body. And my mission was to map a path to what I think of as being a complete person. And I feel that I did that for me. Some people disagree. Some people say I have just left her in a terrible situation, which is also untenable, and I have not given her sufficient progress. I'm talking now about someone I had a conversation with in Germany. And then there are other people who feel that I completed too much. And I let Tambuzai off in a situation where things are going to go well for her. And that person thought that was rather unfortunate. And that person was a US critic.
Wow. I was terrified in the middle of the Book of Not that you were going to make her leave. I just felt like every page that she was somehow going to get some fellowship or something or some sort of avenue, and that she would leave. And it's interesting because last night, part of our conversation turned to South Africa, and I got nervous that she might go to South Africa just because of the timing, that there is such a kind of swell of this idea that this, you know, that South Africa has become a new country, and that people can go there and rebuild and restart, and it's, you know, it will become the global African country in a sense. I was scared that she would go to South Africa and that she would give up on Zimbabwe. I was also scared that she could go to either Europe or the States. And they had the same kind of trajectory for me that, well, you know, she will go there and she will get, you know, an amazing teaching job and she'll end up as a tenured professor somewhere and all will be great, you know. But both of those felt like she would fail the project, the colonial project, in a sense, the sort of undoing of this. Do you ever think about letting her leave?
No, I never did. And the reason why I could not think about that was because my project was about Zimbabweans in Zimbabwe. I feel Zimbabweans have to feel committed to Zimbabwe if we are going to build up Zimbabwe. And committed does not necessarily mean that I'm thriving here, that things are going my way, that I can act here in the way I want to act, that I can build the kind of livelihood that I would like to build. Being committed for me means understanding that what is going on in Zimbabwe is something that we Zimbabweans have to engage with and grapple with and find good, peaceful solutions to. And so it was important for me to have a character who could portray that. Leaving would not have enabled me to explore the options we have as people, the ways that we can develop our personhood in order to be able to achieve those aims of building a country that we are actually proud and happy to live in and can live in well.
So is this really a trilogy?
Yes, it is most definitely a trilogy. I am happy that Tambuzai ended up somewhere where she can now make better decisions for herself, but I don't want to have to partake in any of those decisions.
I'm heartbroken, but I do understand. I'll live with it. Yeah. Can we turn to what you're doing most recently? Not exactly now, but what you've just done. You've just published a new book of essays called Black and Female. And would it be fair to say that you take the history of the country, the history of Zimbabwe, and map it onto your own life and work? Is this a memoir, exactly?
Again, I think it's just that I have lived Zimbabwe, and somehow, without even knowing it, I identified with the country so much. You know, some people are able to get up and leave, and one always feels homesick, but they have been able to do that. Every time I've left, I have gone back. And now I don't know whether this was a pattern that was set for me in my childhood, because I was taken to England as a toddler and went back at about the age of 6. Then I went to England again as a teenager to study in England, and decided it didn't work for me and went back again. This was just as Zimbabwe became independent, 1980. And then I left in 1989 to go to Berlin to study film. The reason why I left in 1989 was that although I had finished Nervous Conditions by about 85 or so, I had not found a publisher. And so I had thought that I would not have a career in writing, and I needed a career. And I decided to go to film school, and the film school that accepted me was the one in Berlin. So I bought a ticket to Berlin, and I went to Berlin. And then 2000 came, and that was the time of the land reform that I have spoken about already. The reason why it came in the form it did in 2000 is that there had been certain clauses in the Lancaster House Agreement that had ushered in independence that regulated the question of land distribution. And so they were now able to implement this particular form of land redistribution in 2000. So I was sitting in Berlin, and I saw reports of some of the things that were happening in Zimbabwe. There was some violence. They used their ex-combatants, which is what we call the people who had fought in the liberation struggle, to go onto farms that were owned by white farmers at the time, and basically terrorize them. And most of the farmers left. And I saw reports of this on German television. And what struck me was that the first time I saw the report, there was a building which looked like some kind of outbuilding on a farm, maybe a tool shed or something made of wood. And there was a very thin, emaciated-looking youngish man who threw a burning log into it. I think the building was already on fire. I'm not entirely sure. And the caption was that violence has broken out over the land question in Zimbabwe. So I thought, yes, I know that's happened. But then a little later, I saw the same footage. And the caption was now that violence had escalated in Zimbabwe. Mm. So I'm looking at the same footage, and I'm thinking, how can this be escalation? But I thought, okay, well, that can happen once. It might be a mistake, a misinterpretation. So then some days later, I saw the same footage again. And I was told that violence was completely out of hand in Zimbabwe. And so I thought, if it is a misinterpretation, I should be in Zimbabwe to interpret for myself. So that was one of the motivations for going back to Zimbabwe at that time. So I really feel that I have a commitment to the country that always brings me back. And I would like that idea of the need to commit to your country in some way to be present in Zimbabwean minds through my literature. It doesn't have to be physical, but you know, I spoke earlier of the people who say, well, why don't you just do your thing and be comfortable? And I think that our country is not at a point where we can do that. I think our country needs our commitment to build it up so that maybe other generations can sit in Zimbabwe and do their thing without the need for these acts of extra commitment.
Are you read in Zimbabwe?
Am I? Oh yes, I'm read in Zimbabwe. There was a time when nervous conditions was on the Cambridge syllabus, and the Cambridge syllabus is a particular syllabus. We have two. There is the local Zimbabwean one, and I'm less likely to be on the local Zimbabwean syllabus, but I was on the Cambridge syllabus for quite a long time. And people really enjoy the book. A lot of people buy it in South Africa, so people are going back and forth, but you cannot buy it in the country easily. There was one bookshop that I knew that sold it while it was still on the Cambridge syllabus, but I haven't even checked to see whether it's there now. People do not have cash available for to buy that kind of thing. There was a time in Zimbabwe when people were saying, well, if you have 2 good meals a day, that's okay. So now we're down to 1. People are down to say, well, at least if you can eat 1 good meal a day, then you're doing well. So people really cannot, most people cannot afford to buy books. But those who can are reading. And in fact, they are reading more and more now. And what I've been told is that nervous conditions has become an intergenerational text, because young people will read it today. Their parents would have read it at school. And they will go back and say, was it really like that? Everything that she's describing in the book. And that's actually one reason why I wrote it, because I could see that the rate of change was really accelerating, and I wanted a record. We are a people who do not know that much about our history for various reasons. We know that one of the tactics of the colonial forces and structures was to eradicate the history of people and even to rewrite the histories of people in order to subjugate them. So I thought, well, this is something that I have seen, I have lived through. In 50 years, 100 years, it's going to be history. And so this will at least be a record. It's fiction, but in terms of the structure of society and the way people lived and the way things looked at the time, there will be a record of that.
Wow. This conversation about history brings us back to an earlier conversation where you began talking about the Bantu migration. Would you be willing to talk to us a little bit about that and sort of what that means for present-day Zimbabwe?
Okay. Yes, I was talking about my commitment to Zimbabwe because you asked me, excuse me, about what I'm writing now. And what I meant to say is that it's the same thing. What I'm writing about now is also my commitment to Zimbabwe. And the book that you alluded to, Black and Female, which is essays, nonfiction, it is simply the nonfiction version of Nervous Conditions and the trilogy, basically. So I feel I simply cannot escape my Zimbabweanness. When I say I cannot escape my Zimbabweanness, that is not to imply that there is a desire to escape it, but it is a kind of willing succumbing. I think because of my experiences outside the country, I am more wary of thinking that a place that is not Zimbabwe will offer me more potential to be called home than Zimbabwe itself. I mean, I'm very much at home in Germany as well because my children are German, my husband is German, and I have family in Germany. But there is this thing that really ties me to Zimbabwe. And I think it is because I have seen those changes from the colonial time and what that wrought upon people, the war and what that wrought upon people. There's a line in this Mournable Body where I talk about the war having ruined everyone's nerves. I have lived through that really heady time that was so full of hope and possibility. That was the post-independence era, about 10 years or so. And I have lived through the present decline to a situation where many Zimbabweans are debating whether the Smith period was better than this latter ZANU-PF period. Wow. I mean, this has been an ongoing debate on social media. And I think that when, as a citizen, one lives through those periods in one's country, one develops a deeper attachment to the country and also a greater passion to see the country do well, or at least that's how it happened for me.
Can you tell us a bit? I think probably most of us will not know much about More Blessing Ali. Can you tell us more about her and about what's happening right now?
Okay. The situation with a woman who was killed, whose name is More Blessing Ali, is, in my opinion, symptomatic of where we are now as a country. More Blessing Ali was a community organizer for the opposition, which is now called the Citizens Coalition for Change, CCC. So one afternoon, May 24 this year, she was at a little business center in her area when two men who were known to be ZANU-PF operatives dragged her away. And people who witnessed it saw this as an abduction. And they sent the alarm out on social media that More Blessing Ali had been abducted. The state replied with a statement that said that one of the men was her former boyfriend or a former boyfriend of hers, and so it was a domestic matter that did not require any police intervention. Very few people were satisfied with that, or at least very few people that I associate with were satisfied with that, and so continued to question where she was. It was then discovered that her cell phone had been turned off, so she wasn't answering calls. So people, through social media, informed the police that she wasn't answering any phone calls, and that did not seem like a good thing, even if it had been a domestic affair, that a man pulls a woman out of a public space and she disappears, no one sees her, and then stops answering phone calls. And the Member of Parliament in her area, in fact, two of the members of Parliament in her area became very interested in the cause, and these are opposition members. And so they also engaged in processes to find out what had happened to her. Meanwhile, the police just said that they were investigating. On the 11th of June, they found her dismembered body in a well that was owned by the mother of the man who had dragged her away. So they were able to establish that More Blessing Ali had been murdered presumably by this person. The police said they were not able to apprehend the man. He had disappeared. And so there was another public outcry on social media, and people would report sightings. Oh, we saw this person over there. He could be arrested at that place. And this went on for several days until he was apprehended. I am not sure how he was apprehended. Some people say he handed himself in. I do not know what actually happened. So in one of his statements to the arms of the law in Zimbabwe, he actually said that he had not known More Blessing Ali before and had not been her boyfriend. Meanwhile, people wanted to have a funeral, and the ZANU-PF councillor for the area did not allow them to have the funeral. And funerals, laying people to rest, are sacred in my part of the world and in many parts of the world, in fact, everywhere generally. And so this led to violence. And this violence led to the 2 MPs who had led to the case being solved, being arrested, along with 12 other opposition members from the CCC. They were denied bail. They are still in jail to this day. They have had several applications for bail, each of which have been denied. One of them, whose name is Job Sikala, has been arrested over 60 times by the government, and he has never been convicted. He has been imprisoned without trial before. So in one of his last bail applications, the reason for denying bail was that he has a tendency to be arrested.
Wow.
So many of us are very concerned with this situation. Wednesday will mark the 100th day of his being in jail, along with the 13 other people. We call them the Nyatsime 14 because that is the area where this happened. And later on, they arrested 2 other CCC people from Nyatsime. And so that is the story of More Blessing Ali. And again, it shows how in the fate of a woman, the tensions that are at stake in the country are played out. You know, people talk about that happening during wartime. Now we see it happening even in times that are not official war times in a country like Zimbabwe.
Wow.
And so we hope to do a social media event to commemorate the 100 days of this detention. And we're trying to put pressure to have them given bail, but anything can happen in Zimbabwe. And if they've been in jail this long, it will be very difficult to muster sufficient pressure, but we are continuing to try. You know, the trial date has been set, I believe, for November 16. So that's still about 2 months to go. And even if we were able to get that bail for them 1 week before, it would be a victory in the sense that every time the Constitution is applied in ways that the people think is not consistent with the spirit of the Constitution, because bail is, in fact, a constitutional right in Zimbabwe. And please be aware that I have to be very careful with my words here. So each time this happens, that sets a precedent. And so it's very important to work to make sure that these precedents are not set.
I think you've just answered one of my biggest questions, which is why you move between fiction and nonfiction.
Yes, yes. I personally did not want to write nonfiction. I write fiction because I can fictionalize things. When things are too painful for me, I can find less painful answers. And I also think that's important because I think if I am experiencing these kinds of painful events and happenings in my country, then other people are experiencing them too. I feel that if I am able to articulate that painful experience, then that helps people who maybe do not live at that kind of level where they articulate verbally their experience. They articulate in other ways. But it is good to have language for what you are experiencing. So I feel that is helpful. And I also feel that when perhaps that experience can be overwhelming, as is happening to many of the youth now, I can fictionalize it to show hope beyond that position of being overwhelmed. Whereas in nonfiction, I cannot do that. Yeah. I've just related the story of More Blessing Ali. And I think that there are times when those kinds of stories need to be narrated in all their starkness and in all their brutality, but that would be for a different audience than the audience that I would be writing fiction for. So I, in fact, am finding it a useful way of working out my own trajectory in life, this moving between fiction and nonfiction.
Do you think that you'd be open to take some questions from the audience? While our microphones come down, I'm just going to read I'll read the address here if you are tuning in remotely. It is ycba.programs, programs, @yale.edu, if you would like to submit a question via the remote link. Please, you'll just wait.
Thank you, Tsitsi. It's really a pleasure to see you here in the U.S. And I remember reading Nervous Conditions, and then it was such a pleasure when this Mournable Body came out, and Grey Wolf reissued Book of Not as well. And here in the U.S., we hadn't heard from you in a while, but suddenly we had your work again, and then you were also in the news for your protests and your activism. And I wanted to ask, what is happening with your trial now? And and what's the situation with the case against you in Zimbabwe?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for your warm welcome. Yes, I consider my protest as a continuation of my writing. I see my writing as a physical thing, something that I do with my body, with my hands to produce the actual script, but that I do with my body in the sense of the memories and feeling those memories. And, you know, when I'm writing something, I always stop to feel it, to see whether it feels correct or not. So for me, writing is actually physical. The situation in Zimbabwe was so challenging that I could not write. There was a time when we didn't have power. So I was writing on my computer at that time. I'm going back to longhand now, not because of that, for some other reason. Then we'd have to put the generator on, and then the generator would be rumbling, or we didn't have water. We still don't have water from the authorities. We have arrangements with neighbors. But these were things, the routine of daily living just made writing impossible, because I was thinking, will I be able to have a shower when I get up this morning? And the artistic community was diminishing because there was no support for it. People were pulling out because I think the international community is just fed up with Zimbabwe, which I can well understand. And so everything was stagnating. And there was just, physically I couldn't write, and there was no creative community that contributed to my writing. And all of these terrible things were happening. And so I thought, if I cannot put these things into literature, if I cannot continue with my Women's Film Festival, where I can bring in films that reflect some of the things that are going on. For example, we had a film about rape of women in the DRC. Many things that parallel what's going on in Zimbabwe. What is left for me to express my concern at what is going on? And so in 2018, after the 2017 coup, we had an election, and the purpose of that election was to legitimize the second ZANU-PF government. And the opposition believed that there was a lot of manipulation of the results, and they went out onto the streets, and at least 6 people were killed by the army. And so a demonstration was called for July 31 in 2020. And I thought this was a very good idea to go out and physically manifest our discontent to the government. The government then decided to ban the demonstration, which they did by an announcement, I believe, in the media, which they control, which I didn't hear. And of course, ignorance is no defense before the law. I didn't hear it, but I did hear of it. And I thought to myself, well, an announcement is not a law. The Constitution does give us the right to protest and to petition the government peacefully. And so since I am somebody who has been encouraging people to do so, am I going to sit at home and quake, or am I going to arm myself with my constitutional right and go out? So I decided to arm myself with my constitutional right and go out. But I hope you can see the trajectory I'm making here from, for me, it is the same class of act as my writing. Yes, I was arrested. I was in prison for one night, and very fortunate not to have to go to prison for longer. And I've been before the courts many times since then. The trial finally kicked off in May, and the verdict is to be given on the 29th of September. So I have to fly back to Zimbabwe for that.
Hello, yeah, thank you. Like I appreciate like all the wisdom and like knowledge you have, and I don't know, it's like feeding my soul. And I think like, I don't know, you talking about like how everyone in Zimbabwe, how like their nervous system is kind of like a little bit fried. I guess what I was wondering is like, what do you do for yourself, like for your own nervous system, like going through all of this, just to like, I don't know, like, you know, like keep sane, you know? Yeah.
That's really a very important question. You know, I mentioned earlier about the clinic, the administrative building, and the beer hall. Leisure was never anything that was considered necessary. And that idea has not really changed. There are community halls where leisure activities are meant to happen, but they are not equipped. I remember going to one because we would screen films in the community halls. You know, we were trying to provide some of that kind of leisure that could help people to relax. And I was just shocked by what I saw. And so I think this is one reason why we have so much friction. We do not have that kind of recreational leisure activity that enables us to refresh our minds. And so people tend to think that the solution is in politics. And so everybody focuses on politics, which only makes it worse. So what do I do? Well, I'm fortunate that I have a reasonably good life in Zimbabwe, so I can manage. I'm fortunate that my work takes me out of the country rather often, so I can get away from it. And I'm fortunate, I think, that I do write because I can work through it in my creative work, whether I'm writing prose or whether I'm writing for the screen. But it is difficult. There was a joke that went round in medical circles. I think they are not even using this joke anymore because I heard it like about 15 years ago. But it went something like this. 1/3 of Zimbabwe is on antidepressants. The other third is on alcohol. And the last third is on both. Yeah.
Please, why don't you, yeah.
Just curious to ask you about Zimbabwean writers, and particularly women writers, and who were some of the influences on you when you began writing? I know there was Yvonne Vera and other writers, but maybe not as many as there are now. And now, of course, you've had a major influence on a whole new generation of writers, women writers like Safiwi, who's also won the prize, and other writers, Violet Bulawayo, who's nominated for the Booker, and Bettina Gappa and others. So I just wanted to ask you about the influence on you when you began, and then your influence on this new generation that's very productive right now.
My influences were mainly Afro-Caribbean and African-American writers, because that's who I could read at the time. Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Toni Cade Bambara, and so forth. Those are my influences, really. When I began writing in the early 1980s, there were not many Zimbabwean women writing in English. And so I was more or less on my own. Yvonne Vera came a little bit later.
Tsitsi, I want to thank you for coming and for talking to us. This has been an amazing afternoon. I really appreciate it very, very much. Please join me.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you. Thank you.